Our story time read for today begins on page 58 of A Child's Introduction to African American History. Remember, we are working on fluency and timing. We will be reading for 10 minutes. Let's begin. Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix's career as a solo artist lasted only about 4 years, but that was enough time to establish him as the greatest rock guitarist of his generation. His musical journey began at 16 when his father bought him his first acoustic guitar. A year later, he acquired an electric version and began performing with bands. After getting out of the Army in 1962, he played with popular R&B artists like the Isley Brothers, B.B. King, and Little Richard. He moved to London 4 years later and formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience. The band's first album, Are You Experienced?, was released in 1967. It included such hits as Purple Haze and The Wind Cries Mary. His next two albums were also quite popular, and Hendrix promoted them by playing before live audiences. Listeners everywhere were thrilled by his wondrous sound and his dramatic way of performing. At the Monterey Pop Festival, he ended his concert by setting his guitar on fire. His set at the Woodstock Festival made him a legend. Hendrix's revolutionary version of the Star-Spangled Banner became an instant classic. Sadly, he died suddenly on September 18, 1970, from drug-related complications. He was 27. For many music fans, there has never been another artist like him. Maya Angelou. By the time she moved to New York City in 1959, Maya Angelou had performed many kinds of work. She had been a dancer, a singer, a journalist, and a streetcar conductor, to name just a few of her jobs. Then she became the most versatile writer of her generation. Born Marguerite Johnson in St. Louis in 1928, she took the name Maya Angelou after beginning a career in show business. She moved to New York to focus on writing and studied with the Harlem Writers Guild. Her first book, a memoir called I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, was published in 1970. The first nonfiction bestseller by an African-American woman. It became an international classic. Angelou's books signaled the start of a long and celebrated literary career. Her published works include memoirs, poems, plays, and essays. She was also a longtime activist and popular commentator on issues of racial justice. In 1993, she recited her poem on the Pulse of Morning at President Bill Clinton's inauguration. It went on to become one of her most famous works. She died in 2014 at age 86. Gil Scott-Heron. Gil Scott-Heron was both a poet with musical flair and a musician with poetic flair. His first album, Small Talk, at 125th and Lenox, announced the arrival of a bold new talent with catchy rhymes and political lyrics that he sometimes recited and sometimes sang. Scott-Heron's style wasn't easy to describe. He preferred to call himself a blue sologist. In the revolution will not be televised and other recordings, he established a style that would influence hip-hop and other musical genres. Scott-Heron, who died in 2011, received a posthumous Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 2012. Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks. As the 1960s came to a close, the film industry was still very segregated. Black performers had few opportunities and were mostly limited to stereotypical roles that didn't reflect the real lives of African Americans. Jobs behind the camera were just as hard to get. When Gordon Parks directed The Learning Tree in 1969, he became the first African American to direct a Hollywood studio film. Parks had already been celebrated for his photography in magazines such as Life and Vogue. Adapted from a novel Parks had published in 1963, The Learning Tree helped pave the way for a generation of black filmmakers that would soon follow. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye had long been a bright light in Motown Records' roster of stars. His roll-licking dance tunes and soulful duets with fellow Motown stars such as Tammy Terrell had won him many admirers. Yet he yearned to do more. He wanted to create music that reflected the social and political changes taking place in society. He once asked himself, with the world exploding around me, how am I supposed to keep singing love songs? In June 1970, he came up with a song called What's Going On? Like similar efforts by Gil Scott-Heron and Nina Simone, it asked hard questions about protest, war, and police brutality. Audiences loved the song. It reached #1 on the R&B charts and eventually sold more than 2 million copies. In March 1971, Gaye went back to the studio and recorded the rest of his album in 10 days. It reached #1 on the R&B charts within a month and stayed there for 5 weeks. It became his first album to sell 1 million copies and is widely regarded as a musical masterpiece. Achievements in Sports, Part 2. Willie Thrower. Like nearly every institution in American society, pro football discriminated against African Americans. Black players were allowed in the league, but the quarterback, QB position, was reserved for whites only. Black quarterbacks who wished to play in the NFL had to switch to another position. After leading his Michigan State team to the national championship in 1952, Willie Thrower was committed to remaining a quarterback. When no NFL team drafted him, the Chicago Bears hired him as a backup quarterback. In 1953, he briefly made history when he played as a substitute quarterback during a game against the San Francisco 49ers. Thrower completed 3 of 8 passes for 27 yards. His short performance as the first black pro quarterback was unfortunately his last appearance for the Bears. He later played for 3 years in the Canadian Football League before injuries forced him to retire. Althea Gibson. Less than a decade after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball, Althea Gibson broke through in tennis. She was first allowed to compete in the U.S. National Championships in 1950. By 1956, she had become the best player in the world. That year, she won the French Championships in both singles and doubles. In 1957, she won the U.S. Nationals and the Wimbledon Championship, the first African American to win either one. For good measure, she won both again in 1958. She retired soon after and went on to compete as a professional golfer. Gibson was elected to the International Tennis Hall of Fame in 1971. Wilma Rudolph. The odds against Wilma Rudolph from the start. The odds were against Thelma Rudolph from the start. The 17th of 18 children born to a poor Tennessee family, she was 4 years old when she contracted polio, a disease that often disabled its victims. For the next 5 years, she wore a brace to straighten her twisted leg. Walking was so difficult that running seemed out of the question. Yet, Rudolph developed a talent for it quickly, and after the brace was removed, she made her first Olympic track team at age 16 and earned a bronze medal in a relay. 4 years later, at the 1960 Olympics in Rome, she won gold medalists in 3 events. We're going to end the reading for today, and we're a little bit under 10 minutes, but tomorrow we will start on page 61, and we'll be reading about Ernie Davis, The Pittsburgh Pirates